So
Welcome,
Angie,
everybody.
Victoria, you should be able to unmute now. There we go. Perfect. All right, Angie, you want to get started?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening on this dreary day, but we're excited to be here to talk to you about our Clyde Butcher exhibit and listen to a wonderful presentation today. So I'm Angie Berry. I'm the curator at Gadsden Arts Center and Museum. And you also will be hearing from Anissa Ford. She is here and is going to be monitoring the chat. She's our education director. And we will be here. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and there'll also be time at the end to ask questions as well. So we'll be sure to do that. So this is the first in a series of Zoom presentations that are in conjunction with our major exhibition, our first one of 2021. It's called America the Beautiful, the Monumental Landscapes of Clyde Butcher. And it's on display at Gadsden Arts right now. The exhibition features 43 black and white film photographs. And in this exhibit, the content stretches across America. It is of the national parks from California to Florida. And Clyde Butcher has really captured the essence of our natural spaces. You'll see some of the images here in our treasured landscapes. And his images also document kind of the changing environment and capturing what's there today and encouraging us to enjoy the beauty of the wilderness. And he raises awareness of these remote places and the species that live there, allowing us to have our own adventures and then reminding us that we need to take care of these places. So we do hope that if you're able to visit us in person, you can. The exhibition is on display through April 3rd. And you can come and visit us. There's no reservations required, Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We do require masks, but we hope that you'll join us, and we don't allow more than 20 people in the museum space at a time. So it's really a safe place to visit. But we also have some really great online content. We have some behind the scenes video that Anissa put together for us of us installing and putting together the exhibition, as well as some great videos about Clyde Butcher himself. So if you can't make it, you can still enjoy some online content. I am excited to introduce our speaker today, Victoria Manchado. She received her MA and BA from the University of Florida, focusing on intentional communities, sustainability, and bioregionalism. After working as an environmental organizer in South Florida, she returned to UF, where she is currently a PhD candidate studying the intersection of religion and environmental activism. More specifically, her dissertation looks at the spirituality within Florida's seemingly secular environmental movement. She explores the values and beliefs that come to the forefront as environmentalists advocate for the waterways they love. The Sacred Waters presentation is really fitting with our Clyde Butcher exhibition because Butcher believes wilderness is a spiritual necessity. When his son was killed by a drunk driver, it was the Big Cypress National Preserve where the artist fled to kind of regain serenity and equilibrium. He says the mysterious spiritual experience of being close to nature helped restore his soul. So with that, I'm going to say, welcome, Victoria.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here with you all this evening, and I would like to give a special thank you to the Gadsden Arts Center and Museum, and also to Angie and Anissa for making this event possible. I'm particularly grateful and honored that my talk is paired with Clyde Butcher's incredible photos. For those of you who have seen them or read through the panels, I think you'll find a lot of connections. So as someone who studies religion and nature, I'm going to share with you a story about water. And more importantly, this is a story about our relationship with Florida's water, specifically how we might reimagine this resource by looking at it within the lens of the sacred. So when we think about stories, this phrase might come to mind: once upon a time. When we were children, we were told tons of stories about enchanted worlds that only existed in our imaginations. And regardless of the story, there's a common purpose. Such narratives are used as a way to understand, learn, and make sense. There's a moral, there's a takeaway, there's usually a principle that moves us beyond the story and tells us something larger about ourselves and about the world around us. And today, we continue to tell these stories. They help us to grapple with complex issues And most of all, stories influence how we see each other and our society. So stories can be fictional and non-fictional, but such collective stories are telling us to look beyond ourselves. So this evening, I am going to tell you a story about Florida and its water. But I want you to understand that this is not the story of state agencies and water management districts, politicians, or scientists. By and large, the current views of Florida's water have been widely contrary to the story that I'm about to tell, which I hope will make it that much more meaningful. So this presentation explores the efforts to restore Florida's waterways through relationships. This is not to say that state agencies and water management districts, politicians, and scientists are not part of the story. They're essential, as we all are, but this evening's story is a story about our collective relationship with our surroundings, and it's a story about human-nature interactions. So we will investigate this through those who love and advocate for these water bodies, very similar to Clyde Butcher. And I hope that we will dive into the conversations that arise when Floridians view water as essential to their quality of life. So before we start, I'd like to know where you're at. What part of Florida are you familiar with? What part of the state do you call home? Are you even in the state? So if you could just fill out that poll and click submit. I'm excited to see where you all are. Perhaps you are, with Zoom, it's really interesting to see how it connects a lot of people from a lot of different places, but it might just be a local, and we might just see like a local gathering. So I'm not sure if we were able to share the results from that.
So I'm just going to share it with you. So
Okay.
we've got about, most are from our panhandle, and then pretty evenly split from north, central, and south of the rest. I don't see anyone listed as out of state.
Sounds good. Perfect. So that's great. And thank you. Yeah, I saw the results right here. This is perfect. Great. Yeah, so for years, as many of you know, especially since everyone's here in Florida, we've been called the Sunshine State. But for this story, I can't help but feel like we should really reframe ourselves as the water state. As many of you know, water is never far from sight. We are second only to Alaska in terms of miles of coastline. And Florida is known for its pristine beaches, inland lakes, rivers, canals, and springs that have captured our attention as residents flock to them year-round. So I grew up down in Broward County, down in South Florida, and if the news wasn't reporting on an alligator in someone's swimming pool, then it was often reporting on these torrential downpours that were imminent in the afternoons, or some kind of pending hurricane that was on its way. Water was everywhere. It literally poured forth from the heavens, and it brought both joy and fear. And then when I moved to Gainesville in 2007, I was a little disheartened by the lack of water. It was actually the middle of a statewide drought that lasted from 2006 to 2008. And I literally saw lakes dry up. So docks were extending to dry land, and the occasional marshy pond or the remnants of what was once a thriving lake stood like these really sad puddles. And more recently, we experienced another drought-like situation as waterways were closed to the public because of COVID-19. So while the virus did not take away the water, for those of us who rely on water as a form of recreation or sustenance, it distanced us from our waterways that we cherish so much. So the water that was still there was precious, and in many respects, it was hidden from the public eye. It was beneath our feet in the Floridian aquifer, one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. So if you're familiar with the springs, the aquifer is a massive network of underground caves and waterways some so big that a small car could fit through, and it supplies the water for all of Florida. So here's the next question for you. How many square miles would you say this system encompasses? And I put a hint in there because the entire state of Florida is just over 58,000 square miles. So we'll see how well you do. Okay, lots of different choices here. So if you said 100,000 square miles, then you are correct. According to the United States Geological Survey, the Floridian aquifer encompasses 100,000 square miles. So you might be asking, you might just say, wait a second, what about your hint, right? It turns out the aquifer extends into southern Alabama, southeastern Georgia, southern South Carolina, while also covering all of Florida. And I've heard that it also extends actually beyond those states somewhat. So even when we're low on water, it's important to remember that there's still tons and tons of water around. And this overabundance of water that we've seen in years since the 2008 drought has supported tourism, industry, and the growing population that in 2014 caused Florida to surpass New York in becoming the third largest state in terms of population. So this overabundance has in many ways cheapened the price of water, giving millions of people the ability to just turn on the tap while also watering their deeply unsustainable lawns. And it has deceived us with the proclamation that there is an infinite supply to use for our pleasure, thereby cultivating a narrative that emphasizes our use and abuse of water rather than how we interact with and engage with water. So in this respect, water is solely a commodity. This narrative has existed since early European conquest, and it's the same narrative that followed us throughout population and development surges that built canals and filled wetlands and straightened rivers. Such a narrative continues today. And if you may recall, our state welcome sign from just a few years ago proclaimed Florida as open for business. So such mentalities lead to a deeply troubled relationship between the people of Florida and the waters of Florida. In 2018, Environment Florida ranked our state as 10th in the nation for industries violating the Clean Water Act, citing fewer inspections of major industrial facilities and lax penalties. So these are companies like Tropicana, Mosaic Fertilizer, Coca-Cola, Pilgrim's Pride, and a range of power companies throughout the state. So oftentimes when hearing this information, people begin to wonder about their own water. But recall that we are here talking about water within the context of more of the humanities, where in this case, throughout this lecture, I want you to, well, really, I want to challenge you to think about what it means to collectively reimagine our relationship with water. More specifically, I'm here to uncover my research into the spiritual motivations of environmentalists who love and advocate for these water bodies, thereby helping us to revise our interactions with water. So by focusing on issues related to the springs and the Florida Everglades, we will dive into the conversations that arise when Floridians view water as essential to their quality of life. These are conversations that arise when Floridians view water as sacred. So for this story, I want to take you back to 2016, when South Florida experienced a series of extensive toxic algae blooms that wreaked havoc on waterways. It harmed marine life and severely damaged local livelihoods that relied heavily on the water. This is known as blue-green algae, and the cyanobacteria outbreak caused lakes and canals to turn slime green, accompanied by an overbearing stench. It led state officials to declare a state of emergency in the summer of 2016. And by 2017, the blooms nearly covered Lake Okeechobee, Florida's largest lake, leading to fish kills and marine kills on both coasts. So the conditions continued to worsen, eventually leading to yet another state of emergency by 2018, the summer of 2018. It was actually July. So agitated by these high nutrients, humans in the third largest state both caused the problem through industry, agriculture, storm runoff, as well as septic tanks and rampant development. And they were also severely impacted by the issue as tourists and visitors kept their distance, causing businesses to feel the brunt of the impact. The sludge that brutally damaged local economies and presented a slew of respiratory problems for those living near the water caused Floridians to realize just how interconnected they are with the natural world. So during the cyanobacteria outbreaks, environmental groups and forums on social media were faced with the task of making sense of this problem in the midst of their work. They had to figure out how to best take action to clean up the state's most vital resource, its water. So while many groups turned to petitions and protests, a handful of individuals turned to prayer and century-old ways of understanding their relationship to water. So one such collective began viewing the state's water problem as a spiritual crisis, approaching this problem publicly through prayer, ritual, and mindfulness. Created in 2014, a handful of spiritually inclined people began regularly praying for the healing of water. And this began several years prior to the severe 2016 outbreaks. They recognized the importance of water, and they were hosting monthly sacred water ceremonies consisting of rituals on beaches and banks of rivers. Holding such events in close proximity to other water bodies, they hoped to raise awareness about the sacredness of water while further connecting to the water through positive energy forces in order to promote healing efforts. And the healing efforts were really done not just for the water, but also for the person, for individuals. So the group drew from the power of thoughts and actions in order to support restoration and to support a clean, loving, peaceful planet for future generations. And much of their overall message is rooted in a power of consciousness. And this is best explained through the Hado teachings of Masaru Emoto, a Japanese holistic healer of alternative medicine. Known by many sacred water participants as Dr. Emoto, Hado is related to the Chinese concept of qi, linking it to alternative practices that engage energy forces to promote holistic healing. In this regard, Emoto professed the importance of words in experiments with water, stating that water crystals can physically change based on the positive or negative words spoken to them. Sending negative energy causes the water crystals to harmfully change, while sending positive energy and thoughts and compassionate prayers helps promote clean water. So trained Hado instructors who studied under Emoto have since brought this practice of healing water and the importance of subtle vibrational energy from Japan to the rest of the world, including Florida.
And in South Florida, the sacred water ceremonies draw from Machado instruction, as well as knowledge from various cultures and a range of other earth-based belief systems in order to honor and bless the water, thereby promoting holistic spiritual healing. And this is achieved through collective song and prayer, thereby reflecting, as people reflect upon the water. They send kind words, they send healing energy, and positive thoughts. And the ceremonies, which are now held on both the east and west coasts of Florida, are usually held within close proximity to a body of water in order to promote such energy connections. So prior to the start of such events, an altar is composed of sacred materials. This often involves crystals, flowers, shells, stones are sometimes incorporated, and it's established on the sand or on colorful blankets. Such items are arranged in a circular or spiral configuration in order to make up a mandala, or a sacred geometrical pattern. The pattern then leads to a large vessel, which is filled with water and placed in the center. The water is usually borrowed from a local water body, and at the end of the ceremony, it's returned. So participants then gather in a circular formation around the outside of the mandala, and many will sit on colorful blankets, others will bring outdoor folding chairs, and they essentially create a sacred space here in order to pray for the water. Another major aspect of the ceremonies is the acknowledgement of the natural world. So in the case of the 2018 Delray Beach gathering, the 4 cardinal directions were invoked and explained alongside their symbolic meanings. So such acknowledgements offer honor to life outside of the self. Not only are participants asked to orient themselves spatially, but they are asked to listen deeply to the natural world. Leaders highlight the songs of birds, the feel of the wind, and the rush of the water. In some instances, participants are encouraged to place their hands on the ground, recognizing the connection between the self and the earth as similar living beings. So in between songs and acknowledgements of the natural world is a deep sense of respect and care for the water. Water is viewed as sacred, a source of life, and the lifeblood of Mother Earth. Machado and other similar concepts of positive vibrations and energy are often weaved throughout the ceremony as leaders explain the water as an active agent with the capacity to record, store, and transmit information. And in this respect, it's able to transform the world around it. So water is viewed as an authoritative living entity, and it's able to impact the world in which it flows. Similar to many indigenous worldviews, such animistic perspectives create a relational bond between humans and nature, uniting the two in a family-like context. In this sense, participants gravitate towards the notion that Mother Earth cares for and loves the human, plant, and animal life within her. So such ideas follow indigenous and Gaia-like notions of the earth as alive, or as mother to all humanity and all life. These ideas, or at least the notion of Gaia arises from James Lovelock, and I'm happy to expand upon that later. But with these viewpoints, it's easy to see why ceremony leaders and participants alike draw parallels between water and the human body, recognizing that both the planet and humans are composed of the same or similar percentages of water. The ceremonies emphasize these connections, providing for meditative silence or silent prayers as participants take a moment to remember their reliance on water for every living process. So apart from this ceremony, Local indigenous leaders host their own ceremonies and draw from generational wisdom. The November 2018 Healing Our Relationship with Water was co-hosted by a Miccosukee grandmother and a co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance of Southwest Florida. It was held on the dike of Lake Okeechobee just after a rainstorm that offered some relief from the cyanobacteria fumes. So recognizing water in a feminine lens, this ceremony looked to heal relationships with water by understanding that water is not the enemy, but the victim. In this sense, and that was a quote that they had told me, that water itself is not the enemy, but the victim. In this sense, water is viewed as a family member, as participants listen to the guidance offered by ancestors in the natural world in order to carry out the ceremony. Nature guides them. So broadly speaking, these rituals, and more specifically, the emphasis of water, expresses larger themes of connectivity. Leaders and participants view the environment as holistic, and they view humanity as one part of what constitutes the natural world. In many ways, they are both within the natural world while also recognizing their own disconnection from it. Identifying such disconnections allow participants to deepen their quest to understand and establish closer ties with the water as they find it to impact every part of life, including their own personal bodies. So such connectivity reinforces holistic understandings of healing. While such rituals occur on a regular monthly basis on both the east and west coasts of Florida, for several years, the blue-green algae that covered Florida's waterways largely impacted these ceremonies, expanding their reach as people began recognizing the importance and the sensitivity of Florida's water. So many of the participants of such events do not simply recognize the changes in the environment from a spiritual realm, but they actively work towards a better tomorrow. And in other words, the participants seek a more sustainable future through the personal choices that they make and the various environmental initiatives that they're involved with. And yes, Elizabeth, thank you for bringing that up. I was actually going to mention, and there's a prayer walk that's happening currently around Lake Okeechobee. I actually was able to go to the first day of that, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that maybe towards the end, but thank you for noting that. So kind of going back to this idea that people are not just praying for the water, but they're involved in other initiatives that is looking for a sustainable future. So some are committing to buying organic food, others are committing to avoiding harsh chemicals for the sake of themselves and the environment. Others are in active conversation with water management districts as they push for more effective policies surrounding water. To speak to Elizabeth's point about the prayer walk around Lake Okeechobee, Betty Osceola is trying to bring awareness about the Assumption 404 that is happening with Florida's water in terms of the federal government is essentially trying to transfer a lot of power to the state. And to say, oh, this could go off on a tangent, so I'm going to hold on to that for later. So some are doing advocacy work, or at least like bringing attention to larger movements when it comes to how we are recognizing our water and how we are kind of engaging with it in terms of policy. So others have jumped into science, undergoing training to become local water keepers or water keeper rangers. Some ceremonies have also attracted a handful of community advocates and grassroots organizers. So regardless, these ceremonies show people that how to reconnect to the water and how they are acknowledging their already existing deep connections. So on a larger level, such efforts to bridge pre-existing divides between Floridians and water remind participants that they are one part of the natural world. And this is a way of reimagining the story. Viewing themselves as one part of the larger ecosystem reminds ceremony participants that it is their duty to care for the other members of society, including animals, plants, natural resources, and ecosystems. Collectively, this view aims to turn the tide when it comes to understanding once separate human-nature relationships. Such outlooks are not limited to the religious or spiritual realm. Environmental groups in other parts of the state are also advocating for holistic understandings of humans and nature in order to drive their environmental campaigns and change our relationship with water. So in 2019, in April of 2019, another separate group of about a dozen environmentalists met in Orlando to rethink human-water relationships. Many of these people showed up, or many of the people who showed up had dedicated their lives to water issues, including a couple prominent spring advocates. Springs protection, to give you a little bit of the history, peaked in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 1999, the Springs Task Force was formed as a response to Florida's growing population and an increase in nitrate loading. And it was a tremendous effort that looked to protect Florida springs through the allocation of springs and spring sheds. And since then, state-based funding for springs protection has waxed and waned, but by and large, springs advocates agree that the state has largely neglected springs restoration. All of this came at a particularly difficult time as big projects like phosphate mines and concentrated animal feeding operations, as well as bottled water extraction and pipelines, presented ever-growing threats and pressures to these beautiful gems. With the most of the efforts to combat the polluters, Springs advocates experienced pushback from both state and local politicians who prioritized industry interests. And for those of you who might be following, there's an issue that's kind of playing out right now concerning Nestle bottled water and a plant that's trying to go in. That's closer to Gainesville, but we can talk about that later too. So the group that met in Orlando began to explore a new way to approach such issues. And with it came the birth of the Florida Rights of Nature movement. This was created with help from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. The activists joined the Global Rights of Nature movement, which secured legal rights for ecosystems, rivers, and other non-human species around the US, as well as abroad in Ecuador, New Zealand, and India. In these cases, such waters were protected by law, and they were following a larger movement. So Florida environmentalists wanted their water sources to be viewed as more than commodities for human use. They wanted water to be legally recognized by granting it the right to exist, flourish, and evolve. So early conversations spread throughout the state, leading to at least a half a dozen groups working on ways to incorporate the rights of nature into local laws through petitions and through meetings with lawmakers and through county charters. So by 2020, groups like SafeBor, they met again, and this time they met at the annual Public Interest Environmental Conference, which focused their entire gathering on the rights of nature. Having established grassroots success, the environmentalists met resistance from state initiatives looking to suppress their efforts. As one environmental leader told me, quote, "It took 8 years for Ohio to pass an anti-RON bill, a rights of nature bill. It took 8 months down here. This is the new vanguard of environmental action." So through the rights of nature movement, though the rights of nature movement is not necessarily spiritually or religiously driven, such initiatives align with sacred water ceremonies as they reinforce different narratives about human-nature interactions. One that upholds a holistic view similar to that of the sacred water ceremonies. In both cases, human nature narratives act as a way of furthering environmental conversations beyond the physical towards a deeper level, towards how people view themselves in relation to the world. And it's important to note that these groups are separate. They have varying views regarding the importance and emphasis of both laws and prayers. And many questions arise. Can water feel the energy we send towards it? Does the water actually heal through prayer? Will laws be sufficient when it comes to securing rights for nature? If we grant water its legal rights, who will speak for them? The questions continue, and I actually have no answers for them, which is disheartening, right? But what I can say is that how we talk about water is changing. And with these transformative narratives, we have the potential to challenge the dominant story that continues to perpetuate the water crisis. By changing our relationship, we are laying the foundation for larger environmental change. So Rick Kilby notes in his book, Florida's Healing Waters, if Florida's healing waters are to be healed, a paradigm shift needs to occur in the very way water is perceived. Recognizing human beings as part of the water cycle is something we have missed along the way. Water is a resource we rely on, but as many of the ceremony participants remind me, it is also within us. So one parallel I like to draw from here is medicine. For years, religion, prayer, and meditation had little to no presence in modern Western hospitals. It has only been more recently that doctors acknowledge the role of these mindful practices in the healing process. In a similar manner, taking this functional approach, ecologists, biologists, and other scientists must come to terms with the way people interact with the environment around us. Furthermore, scholars and environmental advocates must recognize that interaction occurs in many forms. Though it may seem far from the norm, the people who engage in the sacred water ceremonies or the rights of nature movement are also working in favor of environmental protection by trying to shift the paradigm. So both groups represent a rethinking of how we treat and interact with our water. So now the first time I gave this talk to a public audience, I had a 90-year-old woman approach me and ask, does this mean that her water isn't safe to drink? And I realized that I missed the presentation missed the mark entirely. So I had to revise it slightly. The moral of this story is that you have to think beyond yourself. We all have to think beyond ourselves. We have to think collectively about what water means to us, to you and to me and to the millions of others who call Florida home. And it's similar to what Cynthia Barnett spelled out in her water ethics. It's not just the water that's coming out of your tap or your shower or the water you use for your lawns. Those are all important parts of the story, but we also have to think about the water coming out of our neighbor's tap or the water being used on our neighbor's lawns. We have to think about flushing the toilet and where that goes. And we have to think about the septic tanks that are leaking underground and seeping sewage into our lakes and rivers and springs and oceans. We have to think about those who don't have access to clean water, even in 2020, people who must rely on bottled water because their water or pipes are both compromised and dirty. We have to think about the water permits that are being freely distributed to industries that bottle our resources and send them throughout the world, cutting short locals who depend on those resources. And the cycle goes on and on and on. So this is all very overwhelming, But this is our story, so we don't have to tackle it alone. But we do have to start somewhere, and that means rethinking the dominant narrative. And there's one last point that I want to leave you with when we're thinking about Florida's water. In August 2020, this TED Radio Hour featured a program called Our Relationship with Water, which spotlighted 3 women from different places in the US and their push to re-examine their relationship with water. And these included a legal expert from the Shinnecock Nation, an artist who explored the lack of clean water that was still facing the people of Flint, Michigan, and a community organizer and a coordinator of sacred water pilgrimages. So what I want you to recognize is that Florida is joining the rest of the nation in our quest to rediscover our relationship with water. And the most important part about these narratives is that they are beyond the individual. Whether this is saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, drought, red tide, cyanobacteria, given Florida's growing population, its finite resources, and more specifically its water, we will continue to experience strain. It's inevitable. Considering such stories can provide a fresh outlook and may even help the state and us as a collective to further grapple with such climactic pressures. In this sense, the role of these narratives and how we view our relationship with water not only expresses religious and spiritual dimensions, but it gives us a more holistic outlook for solving future problems concerning the intersection of humans in the natural world. So I just wanted to thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to engaging you a little bit more with questions and comments, and if you want to talk about particular prayer walks that are happening as we speak.